here to talk about the Great Brand Reset. And we've got a fantastic panelist to talk to you about it. We have Ronan Harris, Snap President in EMEA. We have Leah Karam, the CEO and founder of Mindscope. And we have Eugene Healy, who is a leading brand strategy consultant. So let's get right into it. Ronan, we're here to talk about the shift in social media and the data behind it, crucially. Now, this research shows people are shifting away from public performance on social media towards more private connections.
Yep.
Why, in your view, are public-facing feeds losing their grip on a very important user intimacy?
So we've been watching this over a number of years, and actually, it was the founders at Snap, Bobby and Evan, who first saw this when they conceived the platform. And they're kind of going, I don't want everything to be always out there and always there for perpetuity and there for everybody to see all of the time. I think what's happened is society has caught up with that. And there are certain things that you want, the conversations that you want to have in a private space. There are conversations that you want to be ephemeral and to not follow you around forever. And we're seeing this shift now play out on the platform in a very big way. So the research is saying that around 60% of people are doing all of their communication with their close family and friends in private-only platforms rather than on feeds for everybody to see. And I think what's driving that is just some things want to be private, but I think people are also tiring a little bit of the need for things to be polished and perfect, and to some extent performative, where it's being driven by likes and followers and comments, and people just want to be a little bit more relaxed. They don't want to feel that pressure.
Leah, do you see this shift as a psychological correction almost after years of digital fatigue? And this is something that we've been talking about for a long, long time in the social media field. Is that what you're seeing in the data?
Yes, I mean, it definitely is a psychological correction. What Ronan just spoke about, there's a behavioral word for it. So it's the dramaturgical theory, in the sense that we see two things, the backstage and the front stage. We've been in the front stage for such a long time within social media. But at the end of the day, as human beings, our needs, our moments, they haven't changed that much. We want connection, we want safety. But what we've seen in the research is people are not being rewarded for it. So inherently, this technological shift is a human shift. It's a psychological shift. Technology at its essence, for years and decades, has always been a human shift. And I think, when we validated it as well, that we need to treat it this way. We spoke about it, I've been speaking about this for a very long time. They need to go back to connection. They need to go back to not just authenticity as a word, but to understand if communities are being rewarded for what they actually want and not what we think they want. And what this enabled us to do is to really understand if they're getting the things that they seek, the psychological needs that they look for. And if you're within an ecosystem where you don't connect with people anymore, then there's a gap there that needs to be filled. So we have to bring back that human connection. We have to bring back that front stage, which goes back to another behavioral theory we've looked at in this research and quantified, which is the kind of social capital theory. It looks at whether or not we want bridging ties or bonding ties. And what we've seen is a lot of people have, within social media at the moment, a lot of bridging ties, not bonding ties. And this is not how you compound campaigns. That's not how you build a brand. You have to build ecosystems. So we've seen that as a psychological shift, but it's inherently a brand shift that we have to tackle, because platforms and kind of audiences and brands have to exist together in the same ecosystem.
Right. And Eugene, this is fascinating for brands and marketers in the room as well, because this shift, if users are retreating to private spaces, what happens to traditional brand visibility? Is the old public validation model just dead?
I don't think it has to be framed as an either or necessarily. I think it's probably more useful to assess what all of this research that Leah's been doing and say public validation is no longer enough, I think. And in particular, I think the way I've been thinking through it as a person who exists across all of these platforms is that there really needs to be a reset in how we understand the taxonomy itself. All the big tech platforms grew up at the same time, and so we gave them a generational classification like Gen Z, and it's social media, right? But I think when we look at how they've grown through their adolescence and into maturity, they've all gone their separate directions, right? And so what we have now is, I think, platforms like Meta, YouTube, TikTok, etc., are not really social platforms in the traditional sense because they are optimized for attention. What are you lingering on? And of course, the metrics, the likes, the follows, etc., are all public as well. I think of them more as social entertainment platforms. And I don't think that's actually a controversial statement. TikTok themselves would call themselves, they're very clear to say we're an entertainment platform. And I think what's interesting is when you look at, if you like, the drift, what does that leave in the bucket? And I think like, when I think about platforms like Snap or Pinterest or Reddit, like those platforms I still feel adhere to the original premise of social media, which was about one of connection. And so I think translating that down into like a brand imperative, what we can see is like users are across all of these platforms. But what do they want from those platforms? When you are on a big social entertainment platform, it's performance, it's spectacle. And as a brand, you want to show up as big and as spectacular as possible. But there has to be a recognition that people show up on those true social media platforms because they're exhausted with that performance and spectacle elsewhere. And so again, I think it's useful to think of the taxonomy of brands like Snap and Pinterest and Reddit together because there are combined principles of what effective brand building on those platforms look like. The brand building itself on those platforms is not spectacular. It is more gentle and more raw and more helpful. I think like good brand building on those platforms looks like providing sources for inspiration. It looks like showing up quietly, purposefully, meaningfully in conversations. It means inverting your brand in a way as well, like using the brand assets that you have at your disposal, but as sort of like a canvas for the user experience. And it means showing up as genuinely helpful too.
That's really interesting that you've said that because I think for a long time, a lot of people have probably grouped social media as one bucket. You know, everyone's in there, everyone's scrambling, everyone's kind of doing the same thing. But as you say, that's not necessarily the case. And is that what your experience is as well, Ronan? Is that what you've been seeing as well? That Snap is trying to differentiate itself and has been for a long time, perhaps.
Yeah, listen, I think this is an industry that's matured an awful lot over the last 20 years, but we're a little bit lazy by all calling it social media, right? Might as well just call it media. I mean, all of these platforms have morphed into very, very different things with very, very different use cases. The primary reason people come to Snap, we've got 1 billion people who come to the platform thereabouts every month. We look at what they do on the platform. We study in detail. It helps us drive our innovation cycle. But the number one thing they come to do is to talk to their closest friends and family, not to broadcast, but to talk to their closest friends and family. And that's very different to what some of the other platforms are built for, right? Other platforms are built to be entertainment vehicles. We're built to connect you to the people you care most about, not in massive numbers, in the numbers that you curate into the groups that you care about. And all of the research into relationships tells you, you know, I spent a bunch of time with Mr. Dunbar, who's, you know, everybody knows Dunbar's number, but he's done a huge amount of research into relationships, the number of circles that we all curate and maintain in our lives, how many people are in those circles. And at the end of the day, the people who matter most to us, you know, if you're super social, it's still probably less than 20 by a significant margin. And a platform like Snap allows you to create that intimacy. And when you get intimacy, you can also be authentic. And I think that's increasingly what people are craving.
And I think when I was looking at this as a journalist, you know, love the stats, love diving into the stats. So I picked a few out that were particularly interesting. So 63% of EMEA audiences now connect primarily in the DMs and private stories. 85% share privately between 1 to 10 times every day. And one that I thought was super interesting is 81% use the camera weekly to communicate instead of typing. Now, I've seen this in real life. I've been out with Gen Z and we've been at a bar and someone's asked, where are they? And they've sent a picture of the pub instead of just saying Weatherspoons. All bar one. But it was super interesting to see that kind of communication. And that really took me back. Yeah. So that kind of camera communication first. Why is the camera first visual communication so much better at building authentic relationships than text or grids?
I mean, text is inherently an information tool. You know, that's what it's built for. It's also obviously, the brain has two things, you know, the encoding and decoding of information. So usually, as human beings, we interpret whatever we receive based on our own experiences, our mindsets, our culture, all of those things. When you look at text as a vehicle for that information, especially when we're all experiencing this like paradox of choice and this choice overload, you tend to, what some people in this room know about, I speak a lot about this, we tend to only filter in the things that matter to us. That's why we termed the attention span filtering span, because if we keep building for attention spans, then we're adding fuel to the fire in the industry. We're building shorter content, but not getting people to experience our stories and experience everything that we want to communicate. If you change the semantics to filtering spans, then you can design for this. And again, as Eugene did mention, it really differs on each of the platforms. But on Snapchat is which is what we've seen and what I've preached for a very, very long time. It's built for those filtering processes. And because it has the camera, that's a reason why it's built for those filtering processes. Because the camera is more of an emotional tool. It's not about facts, it's about feeling. And when you design for feeling, when you design for connection, we're all social animals here, It's not a nice sentence, but we are, we connect with each other. We tend to, bond on similarities, and we bond by feeling seen. That's why we also need to understand the feeling that the audience seeks. They want to be entertained. Great, that's what we need to design for. They want to connect, and that's why this is very important. And we're seeing the reset velocity that we've built the model, the shift in wanting to connect, being translated into the platforms that they go to. So I'd say the camera is one of the main vehicles of that shift because of that connection, because of the need to connect. And honestly, to everyone here, because of the need to go back to our real human truth, not just what they show us, but what we really want. Because human behavior, I'm a behavioral scientist and I say it hasn't changed that much. It hasn't changed that much. That's why we need to use it as a compass for all of us within those technological shifts.
And listen, a picture tells a story of 1,000 words, right? We've all heard that phrase. But I was just reflecting as Leah was talking yesterday, or talking just now, and I was reflecting on yesterday, and I must have sent, I don't know, a couple of dozen messages to friends, but they were all photographs of me with a glass of rosé in the sunset.
Of course.
And lots of expletives in return, but it would have taken me forever to type that out.
You wanted the perfect angle as well.
Yeah. What will drive the most jealousy and frustration among my friends?
That was the motivation, yeah.
Living the good life.
Absolutely. Back to brands and back to marketers. Eugene, how do marketers now measure this success? Because for a long time, the measurement has been vanity metrics like likes or comments. What can brands and marketers think? How can they approach this now with this shift happening?
Okay, so I'm actually going to be doing another session later in the week with Andrew Tyndall from System 1. Tyndall has sworn me to secrecy on what's being released by fear of being clubbed over the head with a pint of Guinness. But one stat that I can reveal from that research is that engagement rate shares almost zero correlation with brand memory. So engagement rate may be because they like this particular piece of content, they think it's funny or relatable to them, it makes sense in their context, but whether or not the brand actually is encoded in the mind of the user that receives that content is, as I said, it's basically zero correlation. I think that's really important. Like, they've always been, hence vanity metrics, right? They're useful in a social dashboard, but if we think about like connecting into C-suite, one of the challenges working in social is that C-suite's like, buddy, I don't care about your engagement rate. Like, tell me what how that factors into brand lift. And so I think like that ends up being the conversation that we need to have. When it comes to advertising on platforms like this, I almost think about the role, as I said before, you're almost playing the role of an ambient context machine when you show up on these platforms through, as I said, showing up meaningfully and usefully in conversations, providing sources of inspiration that are relevant by like making the brand playful and making the user's online experience playful. That creates positive cognitive and emotional associations so that when the consumer is in market, ready to buy, they're ready to buy you. This is like brand 101, but I think like we've forgotten a lot of those 101 principles because we've been sold metrics that are easier for us to consume and digest, even if they really only feel relevant for us and not anywhere like connected into the P&L. So I think like that, being able to connect into brand memory and then being able to connect brand memory into less price sensitivity, into stronger ad performance conversion rates, like all of those things are really what is like important and effective.
I mean, Just to add to this, I think, yeah, we've been sold short term performance, and I guess we are the antidote to this. We're trying to change, the mindset around this, because that's not what compounds. One-off campaign cycles, those vanity metrics, those short-term KPIs, it doesn't work. And I was asked about 2 weeks ago, I think I mentioned that to you at Snap Forward, but about the future marketer and what they look like, and it's exactly this. It's a cultural architect, it's a psychologist, it's bringing in this kind of more of a system-based thinking, and this kind of understanding, this foresight, this understanding of your audience, this understanding of your consumer, to then speak to them, build for memory, build that brand fluency, build for that. Like habits is one of the habits is one of the strongest things and tools we have in marketing. The amount of times I see it being underused. So we have to rebuild for this. We have to rebuild for the encoding of memory. And as brand leaders, that's what leads to this brand success. And that brand success, as we know, performance and brand, we shouldn't separate them. They end up driving performance outcomes as well.
And it's not just a marketer's challenge to come up with effective strategies for infiltrating these private conversations. It's also a challenge for platforms to bridge that gap between a marketer's needs and the needs of their users' demand for tight-knit privacy. How do you think about that dynamic?
So at Snap, we've been watching this shift amongst consumers for a long time, and we've been thinking very carefully about, is there an opportunity to place a brand close to or next to a private conversation? And we've been testing, and over the last year, we've released formats which are now part of the chat experience. There's multiple different formats, but some of them also give you a chance to interact with the brand. And what we've found is the same sort of dynamic where we want our interactions with our friends to be intimate and private and authentic. People are expecting the same from the interactions that they have with brands. So we're finding that more than, a vast majority of people are wanting to be able to connect with brands in response to a piece of content or an advertisement that they've seen, and to be able to give them a chance to communicate authentically with that brand. We're now able to do that as part of some of the new formats we've released on the Snapchat platform as part of the chat experience. And we've got plans to do a bunch more of that over the course of the next year, because I think it's, instead of bridging, it's creating that bonding opportunity on the back of a brand message for a consumer to connect with something that they want to engage with.
And Leah, how do you think about a brand's tone of voice and how that may change when they're going from communicating, with a megaphone towards communicating much more privately and much more intimately?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When you look at a brand's tone of voice, for example, within the chats, it's fascinating, because it ends up being like, we're having a lot of conversations at Cannes this week about the fact that brands should think like creators. Ultimately that means brands need to think like a human being. They need to think like someone that hasn't cracked the algorithm per se, but resonated so much with the audience that they were able to build that bond. So at the end of the day, if you want to build that communication and that brand fluency with your audience, being in a chat, being in that contextual architecture that Eugene mentioned is already a step further in building that bond and tie, if that's your objective. But again, we know it's not about that. We know it's not just about where you show up. It's about the message within that environment as well. So context really matters. We speak a lot about context, but then if you're able to understand your brand's tone of voice, if you're able to understand the message that you really need to communicate, if you're able to understand your ethos as a brand, it's a question I keep asking brand leaders as well. It's like, what's your ethos? Why do you exist? What's the core? Because ultimately, that's going to be your main direction. So if there is a playful element to it, nothing works better in behavioral science than positive emotions and joy and surprise. We see this in organizational psychology as well, where we try to transform companies. But if the negativity prevails, you can't really create those behavioral interventions. You have to understand the emotions that work. It's the same case here. If there's a positive emotion or something that you can crack, test it. Test it on that channel. Test it on a human channel. If it works, but test it. Once you test it within this particular context, then you can see what works or not. I think to go back to Eugene's point, we test less potentially. We have all the tools at our disposal, but it's not enough because we're not taking creative risk anymore. In the past, we had less tools, more creative risk, more creative appetite. Right now, we have all the tools at our disposal, more data, not enough insights, and we don't really use that to power our creativity, you know? So it's time to be more creative, take more risk, test things depending on your brand, but go back to your ethos and see why you exist, what your audience wants from you, do your research, and then design accordingly to create a better bonding experience. And as a behavioral consultancy, we can over time measure if it's bonding ties or bridging ties based on the signals that your audience sets out.
Yeah, and I think just to follow on from your own metaphor, I think it's an apt metaphor because when you have a megaphone in your hand, you stand back, right? Like if I had one right now, I wouldn't be. But if you're showing up in a context like a conversation, like a chat conversation, you're basically, as a brand, you're right here, right? So don't. I know it seems obvious. Don't shout. Don't like. And this is why I go back to this idea of like performance and spectacle work in spaces where everyone is performative and spectacular and everyone is shouting and you're in the like I call it the Colosseum effectively, like that's what it's like showing up on what any kind of broadcast or entertainment oriented marketing. But when you're in these really intimate spaces, be human is of course like be human, be authentic are like important proxies, but I think like just understanding how close you are, and I think understanding the sort of uncanny valley effect and like when you get too close, like how grotesque that can become when you show up so loud and so noisy.
The fascinating thing that we see is when a brand does exactly what you say and they create that moment of human connection. So yes, there's a connection between the individual and the brand, but immediately what the human does is then start talking to their intimate circle about that brand. They go, oh, did you see the story? Did you see the piece of content? Did you see the experience? It's fascinating.
Yeah, at the end of the day, like we see that a lot in our work as well with brands and platforms. We see campaign cycles really stop at a certain point because we still treat marketing as campaign planning, impression buying. You know what we found out? We found out that all those impressions for one of our clients, all those impressions were a result of just people being overloaded. You can't really measure new things with old models. So if you end up looking at where you're at, you're very close to your people, you're very close to your community, use that opportunity to create that compounding brand value that will echo like for the long term. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy media, you shouldn't go, you can, but all the media silos have collapsed. Tech has become entertainment, right? Entertainment has become commerce. Commerce has become media. We need to start treating this as such because I am not seeing it enough. And all of our work points out to a massive shift that brand leaders should take to just resonate with their community. So yes, it's great to still buy media. I mean, it's the epitome of our industry, but again, as everyone knows, being quite bold here, think we need to treat people as people and give them what they want, and that means building a brand. It means building compounding experiences. The experience economy is growing to becoming a $1 trillion economy for many, many reasons, because trust right now can be built in person. So it's very important to start developing that and develop compounding strategies instead of just campaign cycles.
And Ronan, when you're talking to people out here or at home, whether that's CMOs or other people in the C-suite, what do you think is the biggest misconception about what they feel like engagement still looks like?
So I think everybody wants to see the result of their work, right? And when we do something, we want to see the input and the output as quickly as possible. And if you're a marketeer, if you can see a billboard, if you can see your spot run on TV, if you can get the engagement metrics back immediately from something that you've run on a particular platform, it's quite satisfying. Very often it takes some time for brand metrics to really build, and it's difficult if you can't measure the media to understand what's going on in private. And if you go back to some of the research and some of the stats that we've been talking about today, increasingly brands are being built in the private conversations where the brand owners can't see exactly what's going on. We're trying to give them a chance to influence that. But I think brand owners and marketeers need to get more comfortable with what happens in private spaces. And they need to be comfortable with creating the catalysts that might generate those conversations and then let them run.
Leah, if you thought about a golden rule that you could offer people from this research that could future-proof their strategy, what would that be?
One
golden rule.
One golden rule. Okay, so I think we're going to hear a lot this week about the attention economy. I don't think we should mention it as much because we left it in 2025. Again, what this research showed was that we spoke a lot about attention, grabbing attention. It hasn't served brands. It has diminished value. It goes back to this instant gratification. It's a human need as well, that we all seek in our work, in our life, in our careers. But we should also be a bit more patient with ourselves, with our audiences. And that golden nugget is the fact that we've seen the shift move towards what we call like a relational economy. You're going to hear this much more right now and in the future, the connection economy, but relational. Relational in our formula, we won't give it away, but you'll see it because it's also out there soon in literally like 10 minutes. It has the lowest weight statistically in behavioral economics because it's harder to build. That's why it has the lowest weight. Compared to connection and compared to authenticity, we use the say-do gap to measure authenticity because authenticity needs to be debunked as well, and we've looked at that as well. But relational has the lowest weight because it's harder to build because, to Ronan's point, it takes a lot of time, and we're not patient with ourselves. We've got short-term KPIs, short-term objectives, so it's like an industry shift that we need to go through as well. So I'd say just think about it as the relation economy, think about it as LTV, think about it about those compounding campaigns, think about it with an audience-led mindset as well, rather than short-term campaign cycles. So move away from the attention economy into building those bonds with your audiences.
And Eugene, do you see any form or ad formats or campaign styles becoming obsolete based on this kind of research?
There's one thing that I want to do to piggyback on what you said. In this conversation about attention, I think it's again useful to establish a taxonomy of attention capture versus attention appropriation. Who are you creating attention for? So with a lot of these public platforms, attention itself is cheap. Let's think if you're trend jacking, like you're hijacking onto something that is powerful in the algorithm right now. You may generate a lot of attention for yourself, but who actually gets to appropriate that attention? Unless you can scaffold whatever this trend or conversation is back to some strong, favorable brand association or linked into some distinctive asset, the platform appropriates the value of that attention and then it sells it back to you as ad space. And that's fine. Like, that's the name of the game. It's that we'll give you attention for free, but you've got to figure out what to actually do with it. And I think that it's also useful to start thinking about this as like formats that I think are really dying. So if I had this taxonomy between like social entertainment, which I think is spectacle and performative, then social media, which is connection-oriented, intimate, specifically non-performative. Performative social campaigns are the things that I hope are the first on the chopping block. I'll give you a concrete example. Any campaign that has the tagline, "Join the movement." We're not political parties, guys. Like, we're not trying to, I mean, maybe some of you are in your free time trying to restructure the political and economic foundations of our society. But the rest of us are trying to build strong, favorable brand associations that increase toothpaste sales by 4% the next quarter. And so this idea of something, it is performative, join the movement, and it's social, but it's not because it's been redirected towards your own ends. And so the movement itself is actually subordinated to your performance of being in the movement. And it's precisely that type of campaign that I think is performing really, really poorly right now of like, this is not an identity. This is not a social experience. This is not a movement. This is, I'm just make my life better. Help me out a little bit. You don't need to reach up into such higher order brand effects.
Guys, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. It's been a pleasure being up here. I hope everyone in this audience has learned something and can take something away. Please give a round of applause for our fantastic panel.